Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Messinio.
And I'm Steven Sigman.
Welcome to the weekly movie throwdown. It's another week of Elmore Leonard adaptations, and this time we're looking at the 1985 movie Stick, directed by and starring Burt Reynolds. We'll try to explain how you option a book by Elmore Leonard, get him to write the screenplay of his own book, and still make a completely forgettable movie.
Burt Reynolds is Stick. The mob took his money, killed his best friend, then set him up as the fall guy.
I want him to take it.
Play around with those people, you're gonna get hurt.
They're playing a deadly game,
He owes me $5,000.
and he's not about to be the loser. Because if you get him mad, you can be sure of one thing.
Give me a hand!
He's going to get even.
Why don't you push me hard? You might hit the water.
Burt Reynolds,
You know what I came here to ask.
Candace Bergen,
I don't know if I'm ready for you, Ernest.
George Siegel, and Charles Durning in Stick. The only thing he couldn't do
What the hell are you drinking? That regular or apple?
was stick to the rules.
Apple. I'll say goodnight.
Ethel, now say goodnight. That's all you need to know. This movie it's okay, actually. I didn't mind it. We've kind of gone on a roller coaster ride with Elmore Leonard, sort of starting with Out of Sight, really, really good, going to the other end of the spectrum with the Big Bounce. And now I feel like this is kind of in the middle. I mean, it's not as bad as the Big Bounce, but it's not as good as Out of Sight. Maybe not good at all, but kind of fun in its mess. It's a very messy film, and there are some reasons for that we'll get into, but not terrible.
It's a perfectly acceptable movie. I don't know if I'd ever seek it out, but watching it is okay, especially if you, I guess, like us, watched a lot of movies in the 80s. I mean, it has a very familiar feel. It feels like 1,000 other movies that came out in the 80s. It's just got all the beats are very similar, and the overall tone. So, and that's part of what the problem is for me, because the source material actually isn't like that. And so that's why the movie is jarring to me. But yeah, it has all the hallmarks of like a good 80s action revenge type of movie. They were making a lot of at the time.
Yeah, and you said that the source material isn't like that, and that's something we've kind of seen throughout this month, that the adaptations are like, the books are pretty good. I know you've read this and The Big Bounce. They seem to be better. So there's something lost in the translation, and a studio involvement is kind of where that seems to land most of the time.
This seems to be a theme, doesn't it? Every time it kind of goes south, that there is the hand of the studio involved, and that's where we are with this one as well. So you're good on the recap. So maybe you should give a quick recap of exactly what Stick is about.
It's about a fellow named Ernest Stickley, or Stick, as he's known by his friends, who in the beginning is released from prison. Also another theme that we're seeing with Elmore Leonard films. And it starts off with him hopping a boxcar and basically dressed like Indiana Jones or someone out of the Dust Bowl. Um,
Yeah, like you do. You dress like a hobo Indiana Jones, and you get on a boxcar. That's isn't that how you travel? Isn't that the way you do it?
it's really bizarre. And I do want to get into the fashion, because he really goes from that hobo Indiana Jones to wearing a pink members only jacket to just having like a slick gray, almost Vincent from Collateral-esque suit by the end of the film. So there's a nice evolution of his style. But he gets out of prison, immediately catches up with a friend in Florida who takes him on a drug run to deliver money to a cartel dealer. It's a setup, of course, and his friend Rainey gets murdered. He's supposed to be murdered as well. Having no idea about any of this, he's just kind of there for the ride and is implicated. And then he just exacts revenge on the people who killed his friend Rainey. But in between that murder and getting revenge, he takes a job as a chauffeur driver for a millionaire, played by George Siegel, which is kind of confusing to me still. I don't quite understand why he did that. I guess it was in order to get connected to the cartel guy. I don't know. Maybe you have an explanation.
Yeah, so for the second week in a row, like I hate being that guy. Like no one wants to be the person who's like, well, it wasn't like the original or it wasn't like the book or whatever. Like I don't like those people. But in these instances, because Elmore Leonard's writing is so particular and his style is so recognizable in a way, it's impossible not to discuss the adaptations without discussing his work and how they do or don't stay close to it. So unfortunately, I have to be that guy, having read the book and having more of the story about it. And I can explain all those things. Like his wardrobe is actually explained in the book, interestingly enough, because he goes to Florida and he ends up the clothes that he wears, the bright colored clothes, aren't even his. Like he ends up going into like this hotel and it's discarded clothes from someone who had previously stayed there. And it's all these bright polo shirts and these pants that are slightly too tight, but he gets the wardrobe and it's part of this makeover that he has to kind of look less recognizable as the guy that he was before that the cartel almost murdered. So it is kind of deliberate, but also it's plainly stated that those aren't his clothes, that it's almost a costume that he's trying to blend in to being a true Florida guy. So even those little things, there is a reason for them, and it does make sense.
Wow. I guess he can only fit so much into 90 minutes, but that's maybe it's subtle. Well, it is subtle, but it's certainly not referenced as to how he gets that, which is unfortunate because it's very apparent throughout the film that there's an evolution.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. Like with Elmore Leonard, I don't think he does a very good job of creating characters that are detailed. All these little he puts in all these little details about people that makes the characters relatable or understandable or something that you could recognize, even if they're smaller parts. And he doesn't skimp on details of all these little things that happen and why. And that really helps flesh things out as the action moves forward. And unfortunately, in a lot of movies, but in this one is a very good example of how when you take out all the little details, it just becomes like everything else. And you're missing all the little things that make it more interesting or more fun or give you motivation that will make you care. And that's, I think, what's lacking here. But even more than that, the crazy thing about this is that the entire second half of the movie is completely different than the payoff in the book. And you can discuss why that ends up happening. But yeah, it's completely, it's totally different. And they just go straight revenge plot, but that is in no way how the book unfolds.
Well, you mentioned that Elmore Leonard's writing style is never what ends up on the screen. And from what I gather in the last few weeks of doing these is that it could, and it always starts out with him sort of co-writing in a way and making it what it should be. And then suits getting involved and ruining it, which is kind of fascinating. I mean, he wasn't happy with this for sure. And I don't think he was happy with Burt Reynolds, really.
You held Burt Reynolds personally responsible for this one. But so we'll get into it. Like this is so it's almost where the story of the movie is almost more interesting than the movie itself in some ways. So, Elmore Leonard writes Stick, comes out in '83. It immediately gets picked up for a movie adaptation, and Burt Reynolds gets attached to it almost immediately. He loves the book. And Burt Reynolds is also from Florida, grew up there, very much a Florida guy. And he thought he could really bring this book to life. He felt like he understood the character, understood the area. So he gets the book, and he's involved, and he signed on to direct as well. And this is the fourth movie that he directed up to this point. He'd only directed 3 other movies at this point, and the last one he directed was Sharky's Machine in '81. So he directed Gator in '76, The End, which is a dark comedy, which was actually written for Woody Allen, which is really strange, that he ends up starring in with Dom DeLuise. And I'm a sucker for Burt Reynolds and Dom DeLuise together, but that's neither here nor there. So I kind of like that movie. Sharky's Machine, which is a pretty decent action movie, and then he directs Stick. But this was something that he was close to his heart. He really wanted to do it, and he felt like he could do it well. They get Elmore Leonard to actually write the screenplay based on his book, which is probably how you should do it. So up to this point, fantastic. Guy from Florida, Elmore Leonard writing the screenplay. Feel like this is going to work. They make the movie. Burt Reynolds hands it in, and the studio basically tells him that it's a crap movie. They tell him the entire second half of the movie doesn't work at all, and they tell him to reshoot the whole thing. And they bring in a guy named Joseph Stinson to rewrite the second half of the movie. So Joseph Stinson, I'm sure you looked this up, and this is fascinating to me. He only has 4 movie credits to his name.
Oh, but they're good.
Right. And it's like it's almost like he just existed in the peak mid-'80s moment, and then he was gone. But he writes these 4 movies. So he writes Sudden Impact in '83. And the great thing about that is that if you look in the Guinness book or whatever it is, he wrote the line, "Go ahead, make my day." That was him. He wrote it. So he is credited with one of the most well-known pop culture movie phrases of all time. And that was the first movie he had written. Because he ends up becoming friends with Clint Eastwood, jumping back like 2 steps behind.
Right.
He started off making trailers for movies, which is a thing apparently that you could do back in the day. And he made a trailer for, I think it was a movie called Bronco Billy with Clint Eastwood.
Yeah.
And so they kind of strike up a friendship. So he ends up writing Sudden Impact. Clint Eastwood directs Sudden Impact. And then he writes City Heat, which stars Clint Eastwood and Burt Reynolds. So there you go.
Mm-hmm.
Then he's brought in to rewrite Stick, also starring Burt Reynolds. And the last movie he writes on is Heartbreak Ridge, starring Clint Eastwood. So he only wrote movies with Clint Eastwood and Burt Reynolds, which I find amazing.
It's quite a right and fast career.
Yeah. But apparently he does. I think he went more behind the scenes, probably doing rewrites.
Yeah.
I know he did a little bit of teaching. So he's still around in the periphery, but he doesn't have any other writing credits to his name since Heartbreak Ridge in '86. And I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah.
But anyway, so back to the main thing. So they bring in Joseph Stinson to rewrite the second part of Stick. And they tell Burt Reynolds that he needs to reshoot it. And I don't know how much power he did or didn't have, but he capitulates. And it's something that he ends up kind of really regretting because he was really proud of the movie that he had made. And but he just kind of put his tail between his legs, went back and reshot a bunch of things. So the second half of the movie almost entirely is reshoots. And they add more stuff about the daughter. They add more stuff about the romance with the lawyer character played by Candice Bergen. And they turn it into a straight revenge movie, which I don't know for sure, but I have to imagine that is not the way Elmore Leonard wrote it. He probably wrote it closer to his own book.
Mm-hmm.
So we end up getting what we get. It flops. Elmore Leonard is furious that Burt Reynolds went back and reshot the movie and turned his screenplay into what he considered to be a not very good movie. And it's almost, this is the turning point for Burt Reynolds in a lot of ways. Because, okay, so now we'll step back even a little bit further. for those who don't understand how big an actor Burt Reynolds was. And I think it's kind of forgotten at this point because we know him doing more character parts in more modern movies like Striptease and Boogie Nights. So we kind of see him in that role. But he was a true movie star from early 70s, especially mid 70s through the early 80s. So let's put it this way. From 1977, I think, through 82, he was voted the most popular star in the United States. That's 5 years in a row. So that's how big Burt Reynolds was. Starred in a bunch of movies, good and not so good, but Smokey and the Bandit puts him on the map and really elevates him to the highest of highs.
Right.
And what they call chase movies, and I didn't really know this, that his specific genre of movies they call chase movies, which he made a bunch of basically from the mid 70s, through 82, 83. Your Cannonball Runs, Smokey and the Bandits, Stoker Ace, all these movies where he plays drivers or driving adjacent things.
Right.
But anyway, it makes him a huge, huge star.
Yeah. And he was kind of one of the first, he says that he became a movie star despite his films because he didn't love a lot of them. And a big reason for that is because he was just kind of like a stalwart on the talk show circuit, specifically Johnny Carson. He was really one of the first actors to put a personality out there on TV regularly so that people would connect with that personality more than his work. And he was actually the only non-comedian to host, to fill in for Carson at some point, because it was always comedians, Joan Rivers, Rickles, whoever. And he did it because he just loved that medium so much. I think it's more about being a celebrity than being an actor for him.
Yeah. And they actually offered him his own talk show.
Right.
But he turned it down because he wanted to keep acting. But yeah, he was just a very likable guy. Like he exuded charisma and charm and was very likable. And unfortunately, he had never really gotten to show that in the movies that he made. And because of the talk show stuff, he ends up finally getting some parts that can show what he can really do. So here is where I tie all of our stuff together, as I like to make through lines. So to me, he very much ties into George Clooney in this way. And say, well, how is that possible? Well, first of all, both of them kind of came through television. Burt Reynolds did a lot of TV in the 60s. That's where he started out. Even I think he did Rawhide and just like a bunch of TV appearances. And then he tries to break into movies. And
he was a stuntman for a while.
Well, started as a stuntman, yeah. And we'll get to that connection here in Stick as well. But such as a stuntman, sort of making movies, a lot of forgettable movies. Again, like with George Clooney, where they really don't know what to do with this guy. The difference here, which is maybe interesting only to me, is that in this instance, the Elmore Leonard movies of both of these people are hugely important to their careers, but in different ways. So when George Clooney finally makes Out of Sight, it sets him off on the place where he's going to go in terms of his career and finally figuring out what works for him. With Burt Reynolds, after the talk show stuff, that ends up happening in the mid-70s, and he finally starts getting roles that make sense for him. And your Smokey and the Bandit is really like the key role. Movies that take place in the South involve a lot of driving, a lot of wisecracks, that kind of thing, and he's really good in it. But his Elmore Leonard adaptation is kind of the beginning of the end of his career. It's like that movie dies, and it's almost the part where his career starts to go downhill. He doesn't really make another successful movie in the 80s after Stick fails. And then by the 90s, he's moved back into television, doing Evening Shade, and there was some other TV show that he had done that I don't even remember. But it's really interesting to me. So Elmore Leonard movies, and they're playing really important roles in both of these guys' careers, that I mention them in the same breath because I do think they're kind of similar. They both give off an easygoing charisma, a self-depreciating attitude. They're both very cool as they're portrayed on screen, and even in real life, they just give off a certain sense of not taking themselves that seriously, but being cool in a room. But these two movies for them take them in completely opposite places.
I think this was really the nail in the coffin for him. To me, it seemed like, I mean, in the early 80s, he did sequels to Cannonball Run and Smokey and the Bandit. And to me, anytime you're going to start doing those, I feel like he kind of slid out of the 70s and was on a decline. And then he did this. And it's worth mentioning, too, that City Heat was problematic. That came out before this. And you can sort of see in this a few of the results of what happened on that set, where he was hit in the face with a chair, had his jaw wired shut, and couldn't eat for a long time. And he lost something like 30 pounds in a matter of weeks. And the rumor was that he contracted AIDS. And that was kind of a big thing. And he would go on to make Malone, I think in 1988, as a way of saying, look, I can still do this. I don't have AIDS. So it being someone where that's your rumor at that time is probably problematic. But yeah, I mean, the 80s were just a bad time for him, and Stick certainly did not help.
And even more than that, so there's always these moments in an actor's career, and you said that George Clooney ends up kind of finding his way, and Out of Sight kind of helps him figure out, you know, what he wants the rest of his career to be. So here's the moment in Burt Reynolds' career. He had worked on a movie with James L. Brooks a couple of years before, starting over. And actually, Candice Bergen was in that movie. That was 1979. So he makes that movie, and James L. Brooks co-writes that movie and produces it, I think.
Right.
And I guess they hit it off. James L. Brooks writes the role of the astronaut character in Terms of Endearment specifically for Burt Reynolds, that part. And Burt Reynolds turns it down because the guy who directed Smokey and the Bandit, Hal Needham, was making Stoker Ace. And he felt like he owed Hal Needham more than he owed James L. Brooks. And so he chooses to do Stoker Ace instead of Terms of Endearment. Jack Nicholson famously gets that role in Terms of Endearment, wins the Academy Award. That movie ends up being a huge success. And I think that is the moment where he could have salvaged his career and taken it into a different place, made the wrong choice, and he never recovers from it. And it's pretty much the end.
And that's actually the second time he would turn down a role for which Jack Nicholson would win an Oscar, because he was originally supposed to be McMurphy in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and turned it down, in addition to turning down Michael Corleone.
If anyone cares to get an internet gossip in all of this, you can look up the long-running feud between Marlon Brando and Burt Reynolds, which is totally inexplicable. But Marlon Brando hated Burt Reynolds. I think part of it is because when he first was coming up, everyone thought that Burt Reynolds looked like Marlon Brando, and so they would compare them. And I don't know if this is true, but that may be the start of it. And so Marlon Brando never let it pass without insulting Burt Reynolds in some way. I don't know. You can look it up. I agree.
So he's responsible for Burt Reynolds not being in The Godfather, I guess.
That's one of the rumors. I don't know how true it is. It was something everyone believed back in the late 70s that that's what happened. But I think now we know better. That's probably not how it went down, but it was a good story and helped forward the idea that Marlon Brando hated Burt Reynolds and was sabotaging his career. So I don't know.
And oddly, Marlon Brando disliked him, but Orson Welles loved him, apparently, which is kind of interesting.
Really?
Yeah. Getting back to the second half of this film being bad, I feel like that's a cop-out by Burt Reynolds.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I really went off on a tangent there for a minute. I went far afield. We'll come back to the second half, and I can go off with it, and I'll explain to you actually what the second half of the story was, or probably was, based on the book.
Yeah, I think that's a cop-out by Burt Reynolds. I mean, he would go on to do that after not winning an Oscar for Boogie Nights too, just kind of shit on the film after the fact. And if you look at the first half of this film, it's not great either. I mean, there's some bad stuff in there. Like, for example, a training montage of him running inexplicably, which is a bit bizarre. Although I will say, when he is escaping the drug cartel for the first time and he's running across a bridge, I thought, that's a good stride. Burt Reynolds must be a runner. And then sure enough, there's a whole montage of him running later on and swimming. That feels like, I'm going to put the camera on me. I'm a movie star. This is what you get.
Oh, wait, hang on. Also, I thought that the shorts in Rocky 3 were the shortest shorts I'd ever seen. But, I mean, Burt Reynolds takes it in this one. I mean, those are some short shorts.
And apparently the shirt he's wearing in that montage is the same shirt he wore in Deliverance, which I don't know why that would be, but whatever. But yeah, there's also a scene where he meets George Segal, and George Segal has this amazing car. It's a Bentley or a Rolls Royce or something. And Stick explains to him that the trunk is called a bonnet, not a trunk, for a British car. And in the book, apparently, George Segal's character, Barry, is the one who explains that to Stick.
That's right.
So just that little thing to me, along with that montage, tells me that, this film is about Burt Reynolds. It's about Stick. Actually, it's about Burt Reynolds more than it's about Stick, because it's making him just like everything that the camera sees, and he's one up on the rich guy who knows these cars. And it just feels, I don't know, it feels like him saying, oh, the studio ruined the film, is not probably true.
Yeah, and it does seem sometimes that an actor director, sometimes the director gets in the actor's way, or vice versa. And maybe Burt Reynolds was well cast as Stick in a lot of ways, but maybe him directing himself was not the best way to handle this. But it's funny, like I said, the second half of the book actually involves the movie plot. So in the movie, there's that part where Alex Rocco, great character guy, the Godfather, everything. So he makes this movie pitch to Barry, and Chucky and Nestor are all there. That plays a huge part in the second half of the book. And I have to assume that was probably the original movie as well, but I don't know. So movie making is actually a big part of the story. And what's interesting, at one part in the book, and I actually had this because this was funny, they're talking about a movie that they would get made, or a movie they would write, and Stick's talking about a screenplay that he might write. And they actually mention that the movie should star Elliot Gould and George Segal. So they actually mention George Segal in the book, and then he ends up getting cast in this movie as the Barry character, and I thought that was very fun.
Do you know what the movie's called in the book?
It's called Scam.
Okay, because I don't know if you saw, but in that pitch meeting, there was an easel with a poster on it for the film, and the film was called Shuck and Jive. And
that's in the book.
Okay.
That actually is in the book. Shuck and Jive is the actual title of the movie being pitched in the book.
And then it said starring Clint and Sly.
Well, in the book it does mention that, like, when he's trying to sell the movie, he mentioned that Sylvester Stallone was offered the part but turned it down. So all that stuff is probably taken from the book. They do mention Stallone in it. But let's say there's a movie that's being pitched in the pitch meeting, but this thing, Scam, where they mention George Segal, is actually a conversation he's having with with Cornell, the character, the other guy who works for Barry at the house.
Who's Beyonce's stepdad, by the way.
Oh, that's right. So Richard Lawson, the guy who plays Cornell, I mean, he was involved in two of my all-time favorite 80s projects. So he was involved in V, which, if everyone doesn't know what V is, you should go watch it immediately. Best alien miniseries of all time.
So good.
And he was in a movie called Streets of Fire, which I also loved, which I don't think anyone else liked at all. But I loved it. So I'm a big Richard Lawson fan. And the truth is, wasted in this movie, because the character is more consequential and more fleshed out in the book. Maybe in the original screenplay, I don't know. But here, of course, he just plays the same character of the black guy helping out the Stick character who ends up getting shot for some inexplicable reason. That does not happen in the book.
It's cartoonish.
Yeah, that's what I mean in terms of, like, taking the second half and just making it a paint by numbers 80s movie. The black guy has to get shot for some reason. Amazingly enough, he doesn't die though. Well, maybe he dies. I don't even know. We don't even know if he dies. But and that is the thing that uh, brings about the true revenge plot that then moves forward, which is one of the most tired 80s tropes in movies, every time. Black character dies, then the white guy gets really angry and then decides to exact revenge. So, and that's what I mean. So it just becomes a paint by numbers movie, taking out all the fun and character of what was in the original material. So anyway, in the original book, it's not a revenge story at all. I mean, it is revenge, but what Stick does is he actually creates a scam. He tricks Chucky into investing in a fake movie after the investment meeting goes wrong. And he ends up stealing like $70,000 from Chucky.
That's more interesting than the $5,000 that he keeps trying. It's like he's like the paper boy in Better Off Dead, always trying to get $2.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. But yeah, so he concocts this elaborate scheme to steal like $70,000 from Chucky by setting up a fake bank account and a production company and trying to sell him this movie called Scam. And that's actually the action of the second half. It's more of a caper movie than it is a revenge movie. And the character of Nestor here is, of course, you're just prototypical big bad. But that's really nothing like the original story either. Whereas Nestor and Stick don't really interact all that much. It's really him and Chucky and his desire to scam Chucky to get revenge for killing Rainey. And that's where most of the action comes from. And he doesn't just grab a gun and start shooting people. And all of that is off. And the truth is, Nestor doesn't even want to kill Stick. That's not really part of the book either. He doesn't even care about Stick. It doesn't make any difference to him. He ends up wanting to get rid of Chucky because he starts to think Chucky's a liability. And the character Moke basically goes to take care of Chucky. That part is all kind of true, but it all plays out differently. Stick doesn't really show up there in that way. There's not that standoff. That all of that is just made for the movie to kind of put Stick at the center of the story. The standoff between Chucky and Moke is its own thing. And here's the other important part. The character that Candice Bergen plays, Kylie MacLaren, she is a really important character throughout the entirety of the book. She ends up being Chucky's investment advisor as well as Barry. And she has a lot of interactions with Chucky. And she's actually in the apartment when Moke comes to take care of Chucky.
Ooh, okay.
So she's there experiencing all of this. And that ends up really shaking her. And, her and Stick ends up showing up and they kind of get out of there, once everything goes down. And it's kind of the thing that makes her realize that she doesn't want to be a part of this world. And she walks away from Stick. That ridiculous ending where they're driving cars, they meet in the middle, it's one of the most absurd endings I've ever seen for a movie.
Why didn't one of them just pull over? Why did they both have to turn around? It made no sense. That was shocking.
Yeah. So, talk about a tacked on kind of last second reshoot. That has reshoot written all over it. It just
100%.
Nothing to do with the movie itself. They just wanted to end with your classic romance at the end, and they just throw it in. But yeah, she ends up walking away because she realizes that this is kind of a world that's too much for her, and she leaves. And her and Stick do not end up together, which makes more sense. And that's part of it too, where you talked about the idea of it being more about almost Burt Reynolds than about Stick himself. And you have to wonder, because in the book, Stick is not right all the time. He's not cool all the time. Things don't necessarily go right for him. There's a great scene with him and his ex-wife, and it makes him out to be like every other Elmore Leonard character, kind of flawed, a little bit dim in certain ways, but good at what he does, but not always ending up right. And that's important to think that he's not perfect, whereas the movie doesn't really go out of its way to do that. And one other thing, here's another good example. the scene in the trailer where he throws the gasoline in the guy's face. We find out in the book that wasn't gasoline at all. It was water, because he was like, where the hell am I going to get gasoline at 10 o'clock at night? Like, so he just baked it with water. And that's what I mean. It takes a one-dimensional kind of like badass character and turns him into something more. Someone with a little bit of intelligence, a little bit of humor, a little bit of self-depreciation, which that character doesn't really show in the movie.
Right.
But in the book, it comes out a lot more.
That's why I don't think it's all the studio's fault for how it turned out.
Right.
But a couple things, that the scene, the pitch meeting for the film, Candice Bergen, Kylie, just is suddenly like, she shoots it down. And it's so shocking because there's no development of her whatsoever prior to that. And I think that really shows the script edits that were made, because I assume that a lot of the things that were cut out and reshot have to do with her, because just like the daughter, who is completely useless and unnecessary, she is really not of any consequence other than to be like a woman who's there for Burt Reynolds. But she has this huge moment where everything's been leading up to this meeting, right, and then she's like, oh, this is fraud. And she gets that exposure, which I don't understand. But and then another thing is Burt Reynolds, or Stick's ex-wife, which isn't even in the film, but she was originally a character. There were several characters who were cut out. Annie Potts was in the film, and she's actually on the poster, but she's completely cut out. And Tammy Wynette was cast to be Stick's ex-wife, the country singer, but she's not even in the film. So it's really just bad editing, I think, and just bad rewriting of this script. I can understand why Elmore Leonard would take the poster for this film, which has the tagline of, he could do everything except follow the rules, and put a Post-it over rules with the word script and hang it in his den, which is what he did. Because it seems like, even though I don't trust that Burt Reynolds is like altruistic about this and made a perfect film that wasn't all about Burt Reynolds, I can see why he would still be pissed about where it ended up, because I don't know that it was perfect to begin with, but it's really a mess now. And I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if this were a Canon film. Like, it's so ridiculous. So it's kind of shocking. And it's a great example of what editing and rewrites can do to a story, because it sounds like it had a lot of potential. And even though it's entertaining, I don't know, it could have been so much better.
Yeah, using the daughter as, getting kidnapped, it's kind of like, where the hell does that even come from? Like, again, it's like, it's just wedging her into the story to give it more emotion. It's like, it's just not in any way how the story was supposed to go. And the sad part too is, I think the ex-wife's character was needed, because, as I said, it gives you a different dimension of Stick, because she has no respect for him at all. She looks at him as a deadbeat who didn't pay her any child support when he was in jail for 7 years. And the kicker is, at the end of the book, after he ends up scamming Chucky, and he thinks he's got it made now, he's got $70,000 to his name, she ends up suing him for back child support.
Whoa.
For $10,000 a year for every year he was in jail, so $70,000. And that's kind of the kicker of the story. And he like tries to skip town. Like, that's how the story ends.
That's interesting.
Right, that's just fun and funny. Again, like, not everything works out for the characters in Elmore Leonard books, and that's what makes them fun. Where all these little,
that's not cinematic, though.
No, it's not cinematic, but it is interesting, though. I agree.
Yeah, that's a way better ending. That I love that. But you can't film that.
But the other part that I think is really funny is, I said, there's a lot of stuff about movies in the book, and that plays a key part in the whole third act of the book. But there's a conversation that he has with an assistant to the executive, the Alex Rocco character. In the book, there's another character. She's his assistant, which they cut out completely. But she talks about movies. And this I'm actually going to read this because I think it's really funny, and it shows you, probably gives you an idea of what Elmore Leonard thinks about movies, where he says, it, after saying that the lawyers don't even like movies or watch movies, she says the lawyers and the business types answer to the egomaniacs running the conglomerates that own the majors, and none of them know dick about film or has any kind of feeling for it. She says you want a development deal now, you have to bring them a story that takes place on a giant pinball machine with a lot of flashing lights, and just goes on to like bash the idea of trying to get movies made for studios at that period of time. So,
and today, I mean, that holds true more than ever. That's very, not just prescient, but like evergreen. I mean, that's
yeah, and it shows you what his feelings already were about movie studios, and then they end up, butchering his screenplay of the movie based on this book. So that, I guess that's irony, maybe.
it seems like he's in the wrong line of work. I mean, at least as a screenwriter, because he seems to just have a genuine hate for Hollywood. Thank goodness for Steven Soderbergh, but it seems like everything prior to Out of Sight was just garbage to him, and everything after it. I don't know how he felt about Jackie Brown, but I would imagine he probably feels pretty good about that. I don't know. But yeah, this one is just entertaining. I would definitely watch it again, or watch it for a first time, like recommend it for someone, but it's not something to seek out necessarily.
Right. I mean, the way I see it is a perfectly fine movie. It's very representative of movies that were made during this time, which does make sense. They're trying to hit what people might go see. Of course, it fails. Even what I love is that this is a mid-'80s movie because the score of the movie is so mid-'80s.
Oh yeah,
it's like that heavy bass and electronic drums with the synthesizer. I mean,
so good.
If you didn't know anything about this movie and just listened to the score, you would know it was made in the mid-'80s. Like, I mean, it's beautiful.
Yep.
So, so for that reason alone, but yeah, it's, if you like these kinds of movies, these guy with a gun revenge movies from the mid-'80s. I mean, Charles Bronson made a bunch of them. I mean, Clint Eastwood made quite a few. Then you'll think this movie's perfectly fine, especially if you don't know anything about what the original story was. But just understand that you're not getting an Elmore Leonard story as you might assume it to be if you like his work. That's not what this is in any way.
Right. And I don't think you can be any kind of film connoisseur and not see the problems with this film. If somebody's just a casual moviegoer and watches it, it's fine. But there are just such obvious problems that it's unavoidable, that it's going to be a little problematic for you. The ending, I want to talk about the ending because I felt like I knew what was going to happen. I thought there was so much, this is me giving the screenwriting way too much credit, but I thought there were all these little hints throughout of what was going to happen. So when he's running, there's a goon who follows him into like a park bathroom or something. He falls down from the ceiling because he's somehow stuck on the ceiling. And then he puts this goon in a urinal and flushes water on his head. Perfect. So when he goes to Nestor's place, Nestor's the villain, right? Yeah.
That's right.
He goes to Nestor's place with a machine gun, which is in the poster, and we haven't seen for the entirety of the film, but all of a sudden he has a machine gun, and how he's not killing everyone in sight from like 3 yards away is shocking to me. But he does unleash scorpions on someone, which is pretty amazing, I have to say. Nestor's standing behind a bar, and he shoots all of the alcohol around him. So it rains down on his head, just like the water from the urinal did on this goon. So I'm thinking, oh, they planted the seed for this. But then the other thing is, there are 3 times throughout the film where he either lights a book of matches or a lighter and sets something on fire. So I'm thinking, this is amazing. He's going to shoot all of this alcohol and then he's going to light Nestor on fire. It's been building to this. It's so perfect. And then no, Nestor surrenders and that's the end of it. It's so stupid. They've been laying this groundwork for such a great ending and then they don't do it. Maybe that was reshot. I don't know. But that was very disappointing.
That's an excellent point. one part for me in the script that for me says everything about the script and probably the rewrite. Where at the end when Nestor's number two tells Moke to take care of Chucky and Stick, and he's like, "You understand what I'm saying to you, right?" And Moke says yes, and then he says, "Blow them away," and it's like he just told you he understood what you were saying. What you didn't need to like you didn't need to say it. You got it.
Is this the scene where he goes to find Moke, who is just doing like target practice with a pistol in the middle of nowhere?
That's right.
That's like his day
Yeah.
off.
Yeah, that's right.
Let's talk about Moke. I mean, first of all, and we should mention Charles Durning as Chucky, because that character is absolutely nuts with the eyebrows and the hair. So amazing. But Chucky lives in this high-rise apartment building, and what eventually happens is Moke gets thrown over the side, as does Chucky. Moke is holding on, for this climactic kind of Alan Rickman in Die Hard scene where he plummets to his death. He's hanging right in front of another balcony. Why does he have to fall all the way to the ground when he could just land on the balcony beneath him? It's a building of balconies. That was shocking to me. But I do want to mention Moke. He's played by Dar Robinson, who is a famed stuntman in Hollywood.
And this is his only film credit, as far as
right.
we know. This is the only movie he actually was in.
Right. And he actually invented a technique for that shot where he falls to his death called the decelerator, where instead of leading up to someone falling and having an airbag below them, he rigged something where he could use a cable and the camera could follow him. So he falls down slowly without having to splatter on the ground or land on an airbag. So pretty innovative stuff. And he's an interesting guy. I mean, he would actually go on to die on the set of a film called $1 Million Mystery in 1986, where he was impaled by a tree, which is like heartbreaking. And
really sad because it was a minor stunt. It was just a motorcycle stunt. And he
right.
took it past the stop point, which is really unfortunate because he'd done a ton of really dangerous stunts, and apparently he'd never broken a bone.
Right.
In the 13 years he'd been doing stunt work up to that point. So it's really tragic. If you watch Lethal Weapon,
that's what I was going to bring up.
At the end of, yeah, go ahead. We'll let you do it then. Go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to ask you because he did the stunts on that, and I was wondering if Mr. Joshua was inspired by Moke as a character. That's
a great point. I definitely could see that being possible, and I'm sure that's what he did the stunts for. I couldn't imagine that he wouldn't have.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a really good observation. That's probably true. But at the end of Lethal Weapon, at the end of the credits, there's actually a tribute to him. There's a tag at the end dedicating the movie to him, because he really was beloved in the film community and known as probably one of the greatest stuntmen that had ever been. So, and this is the only film he ever started. So you get to see him playing a character, which is fun.
Yeah, and he plays an albino, which makes me think about great albino villains in films. Why are they picked on as like, terrible people? But there's a laundry list. I mean, Mr. Joshua was supposed to be an albino, right?
The 80s was a good time for albino villains. Well, I mean, depending on whether or not you like albino villains or like the portrayal, but a lot of albino villains in the 80s.
Yeah.
I don't know why that was.
Tobin Bell and the Firm.
Drug cartels and albinos were like the key villains of 80s movies.
It's really interesting. But also interesting is the film that this is the weirdest thing. And coincidentally, I heard this on another podcast the other day, so I'm going to bring it up. The film $1 Million Mystery, on which Dar Robinson died, it's about someone getting a lot of money and keeping it in trash bags. And Tom Bosley is in it. So it's a film that had a tie-in with Glad trash bags. That was the promotional material. Glad trash bags, which is one of the coolest things I've ever heard.
And we thought making movies about Hasbro toys was a problem. When you're making movies because of trash bags, I think your premise is off from the very beginning.
Yeah. I mean, it goes to show you, if you're creative enough, you can make a movie out of anything. Yeah, I don't know. Do you have anything else on this that you want to talk about?
Just a couple of useless things that I stumbled on as I was going through this that I find kind of fascinating. But first of all, the movie ends with a song by Canadian treasure Anne Murray, which is wonderful.
Mhm.
That was probably my favorite part of the whole movie. I got a soft spot for Anne Murray. I don't know why, but it's lovely. But the crazy part is I'm watching the credits, and the song, which is called "I Don't Think I'm Ready for You," which was a minor hit in the mid-'80s. If you look it up, one of the songwriters it
Mhm.
says is B. Reynolds, and I freaked out. I'm like, did Burt Reynolds co-write this song?
Wow.
And I got really excited that Burt Reynolds was writing songs. I didn't know it. Unfortunately, is a guy named Billy Ray Reynolds, who is well-known
Ah,
country songwriter. So those dreams were dashed, but still quality Anne Murray ballad, which she was the queen of from like the late 70s and the early 80s. So that was fun.
Burt Reynolds must have had an album though, right? At some
I
point.
don't think so. I don't think he actually went that far with it. But one cool thing I did learn about Burt Reynolds in looking him up and look through his career, and I didn't know this, that he started a production company with Burt Convy. Now, if anyone watched game shows from the 80s, you know Burt Convy. Look him up. So he started a production company with Burt Convy called Burt and Burt Productions. And they created the TV show Win, Lose, or Draw, which was something that Burt Reynolds used to play at home with his friends. And they turned it,
Really?
yeah, well, that was his, like, he used to play a lot when he was at home. And so they turned into a game show, which was a huge hit. Got syndicated, Burt Convy hosted it. It was a big thing. So anyone that watched game shows around that period of time will remember it. But yeah, so Burt Reynolds' film career may have been tanking, but he was making that sweet game show money, which I didn't know about. So that's pretty interesting.
That is interesting. And then he did a lot of television after that. Evening Shade in particular.
Yeah. Once I think Stick was kind of the beginning of the end of his movie career, his leading man movie career, unfortunately. And so he found refuge in television. And that's kind of where he was for a while until he was able to revive his career.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Boogie Nights, it shows you what he can do as a character actor, as a supporting role. And he's amazing in it, despite
Yeah.
all of the problematic environment around the filming. But he's so good, in fact, that Paul Thomas Anderson wanted him in Magnolia as well, but he turned it down.
So I hate to bring everything to Stallone somehow, but in some ways, Burt Reynolds does remind me of Stallone in that way, where it becomes someone who becomes successful and then whose ego almost gets in the way of them truly being able to reach the potential that they can have as an actor, whether by choice or by not. I mean, I'm sure Stallone's very happy with the way his career ends up, but there are choices that could have been made, but due to ego, you go a different path. And I think that Reynolds had that one, turning down in terms of endearment, but he also turned down the part that Alan Alda played in California Suite. He turned that down too. He said the part was too small. And there are all these little moments where he could choose a different way, but he's very happy being Burt Reynolds. And the celebrity and the ego, I think, kind of get in the way of the work and where it can take you.
Yeah.
And so he ends up with the career that he has, which isn't bad by any means. But that's the thing: you find out later in life when he starts doing character parts, he really was a good actor, and wasn't appreciated for it, partially because of the roles that he took, and some of the lazy acting performances that he ends up turning in. But yeah, that's just, unfortunately, that's the way that it goes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the celebrity status only goes so far. I mean, that's going to fade, and then the work has to stand for itself. So it's unfortunate, but it worked out. Thank goodness he was down in the dumps, and Paul Thomas Anderson convinced him to be Jack Horner in Boogie Nights, because that is an amazing role, even though it's well documented that it was problematic for Burt. But yeah, so Stick, we thought it was okay. Critics did not. There aren't a lot of Rotten Tomatoes critic reviews for this that are searchable anymore. I think there were like 10 at most. But the critic rating is a 38%. Not really surprising. What is surprising is the audience rating is 37%, even less than critics. I imagine that's because Kino Lorber released this on Blu-ray in like 2012 or something. And so the people who are watching it aren't people who were in the 80s who would enjoy something like this. I don't know. That's pure speculation. But I can't imagine younger people enjoying this unless it's ironically. Maybe I should look up Amazon reviews in the future and see what they say. But yeah, didn't do very well either. Had a $22 million budget and it only made $8.5 million, which is not good. And 3.5 of that were opening weekend. It did take the weekend though, opening weekend with 3.5 million, just beating out just one of the guys.
No way.
Yeah. So listen to this top 5 for this weekend. And I think it was April. I can't remember, but not a hot weekend for films. Stick at number 1, 3.3 million. Sorry, 3.4 million. Just one of the guys, 3.3 million. At number 3, Police Academy 2, their first assignment, with 3 million. Number 4, Moving Violations. You remember that movie with Bill Murray's brother?
Oh, no. I thought that was, I got that confused with a Richard Pryor movie. No, I don't even know that movie.
He has to go to driving school basically because he loses his license. And it's just like this ensemble of all these weird people, like old ladies and people who have had their licenses taken away. It's a lot like summer school. So very much of that time with like a merry band of weirdos. But anyway, that came in at number 4 with 2.2 million. And then holding tight for many, many weeks at number 5 was Mask with 5.1 million, or sorry, 2.1 million. So quite a weird weekend at the box office. And I don't know, it makes sense that Stick would take number 1, I guess. But man, I don't know. I'd go see just one of the guys over Stick, I think.
I love everything about that top 5. That's just the most 80s top 5.
It really is.
That's
Yeah.
wonderful. And
Yeah.
I don't know what to say about just one of the guys. We're not going to even talk about that. Maybe one day we'll do a whole podcast on just ridiculously insane movies that came out in the 80s. But
that probably shouldn't be watched today.
yeah, we'll put a pin in that one.
Yeah. But yeah, so that's Stick. It's not the worst Elmore Leonard adaptation, but could have been a little better. I'm glad that we watched it though, because I didn't know a lot about Burt Reynolds, it turns out. I guess I never thought about it, but pretty interesting career up and down that I wasn't aware of. I just assumed he was always Burt Reynolds, and that wasn't the case.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. We know it's almost where the caricature takes over from the actual person, and it's interesting to go back and look at someone like him because it really is forgotten how huge he really was, how popular he was, and how successful a lot of his movies were for many, many years. So that's one reason it's interesting. But I also think it's cool because what we're doing is we're looking at, inadvertently we've kind of looked at things through all its permutations of Elmore Leonard stuff. I mean, we didn't get too far into the 70s, but it's good to look at an 80s adaptation, and then see, the 90s adaptation, and then see a 2000s adaptation. And so we're kind of seeing the evolution of where people took Elmore Leonard work, depending on the year that it was made. And the 80s just were not a good period of time for a subtle kind of humorous work like Elmore Leonard. 80s movies were very blunt. Every 80s movie was a pretty blunt object.
Yeah.
And a straightforward thing. And his type of writing just doesn't really lend itself to the kind of movies that were being made at that time, I think.
Yeah, it really not a decade for nuance or
No.
movies without explosions. But that brings us to next week's episode when we are going to wrap up Elmore Leonard month. And I think this one's going to be interesting. These we're going to do a double feature. And I think these are the 2 Elmore Leonard films that I kind of associate the most with him, maybe because they're some of the most recent that I've seen. I don't know. But we're going to do Get Shorty and Be Cool, which are an original and a sequel starring John Travolta. As I think about it, I haven't watched them yet, but I can really see these threads of Elmore Leonard's writing in all of these, whether the films are good or bad. But he really has a style that I find it interesting. That guy gets out of jail, goes to do another score, somehow gets involved in Hollywood. Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. So I'm looking forward to digging into these and seeing how they compare to the 80s stuff, because I think they'll probably be a better fit for his writing.
Yeah, and I think it's fun that we just did this movie, which was originally about movies, but and him kind of getting screwed in the process by Hollywood. And Get Shorty is very much a movie about movies and the film business, and it's kind of fun to see the prism that he now sees it through as he makes the movie. Now knowing the history of Elmore Leonard in Hollywood, so I think the movie takes on even a little bit of an added twist with that. So that will make it even more fun to watch.
Yeah, I think it's a good way to end the month. Just to kind of, that's the embodiment of his perception of everything we're covering. So it'll be interesting. I don't know how close to his writing the films are. That's something we'll learn throughout the week. But yeah, if it holds true to everything else we've done, it's going to veer off a little bit. Sometimes that works, like with Out of Sight, and sometimes it doesn't. But I have a feeling this one's going to hold up. Both, maybe not Be Cool as much, but I think Get Shorty is going to be a fun watch. So we'll see.
Yeah, and as we mentioned, I mean, Get Shorty is kind of the start of it ends up leading to Out of Sight. So I mean, Get Shorty is really kind of the movie that shows how you can make Elmore Leonard movies in Hollywood. So yeah, this will be a good one.
All right. So that's it. Thanks for listening, everyone. And be sure to follow us on the internet at patreon.com/moviethrowdownpod. We're on social media everywhere as at moviethrowdownpod. Subscribe to the podcast, rate and review it. That really helps us out. And thanks again. We'll see you next week. So long.